Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War for PC. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Relic and published originally by THQ back in September of 2004. And it's fairly noteworthy for a few reasons. The first of them being that this was certainly a well-received game, but it was really one of the first truly successful Warhammer 40,000 video games. You had some before this, but up until Dawn of War, people generally didn't know Warhammer 40k in the video game scene. It was a very niche thing. And even in the non-video game scene, Warhammer is a pretty niche game. It has a very high cost to entry with all the miniatures costing ridiculous amounts of money. But then you have something like this, which doesn't have as high of a cost of entry and gets people introduced to the lore and everything, or kinda sorta. There's a lot of lore behind Warhammer 40k, so people who were introduced at Dawn of War don't necessarily have the full picture. So, if you're going to look into the lore of that thing, I recommend you do it on your own time, because I don't really have time to go over it in this review. But the real question here is, how does this game pull off Warhammer 40,000? Does it do the tabletop lore justice? And how is it as a real-time strategy game in and of itself? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which at the time was pretty fantastic. It was one of those 3D rendered real-time strategy games that actually looked really, really solid. And even today, the amount of detail they put into everything really does pay off, and it really has aged pretty well, surprisingly. The interface is nice and clean. You've got some really nice animations in particular that have a surprising amount of detail in them. You have textures that are okay for the time they were made, but obviously we've made some pretty big advances since then. And all of the particle effects and such are surprisingly still good. So the amount of detail they put into it really did pay off, and it certainly still looks pretty good to this day, even though it certainly does look dated. And then there's the sound design, which is where things really kicked up when the presentation's concerned. You have an excellent soundtrack that is full of these epic orchestral tracks that just really get you into the feel of the Warhammer 40,000 in the grim dark future there is only war vibe, and it just succeeds brilliantly at getting you pumped for the battles to come. The sound effects are also very, very solid. You have some very beefy explosions and such like that for a real-time strategy game anyway, and so they did a great job with getting you into the feel with all the sound effects as well. And then there's the voice acting, which is glorious. As in, you have things like the orcs being their ridiculously overblown Cockney accents and just being completely hilarious all the time. As well as the glorious, over-the-top religious zealotry of the Space Marines doing their whole "for the Emperor" thing. It's just wonderful to listen to the ridiculously over-the-top voice acting here, and you can tell that the voice actors had a ton of fun doing what they're doing. So, all in all, the presentation is utterly fantastic for this thing, and really does get you into the Warhammer vibe. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as the Blood Ravens, a chapter of the Space Marines who serve the Imperium of Man. I've probably already lost a few of you, so if you're lost, then please check out this Lore in a Minute video that just goes over the backstory to Warhammer 40k, and that'll help things out a bit. But I'm really focusing on the plot of Warhammer Dawn of War here, so what ends up happening here is that you play as the Blood Ravens, who are the chapter that Relic themselves made up, and that actually got introduced into the Warhammer canon because of this, and they make planetfall on Tartarus, which is an Imperial planet that, when you arrive there, is being attacked by orcs. If you know anything about Warhammer lore, then you know that an orc invasion is a huge deal and is very, very hard to actually get rid of, hence Space Marines. And so you take control of Gabriel Angelos' forces and basically fight back against the orcs, only later to find out that chaos has come! So, naturally, of course, now you have to fight chaos, and the Eldar are involved too, so you gotta deal with that problem. And the plot itself gets more and more convoluted as you go through. It's not a terrible plot, and it certainly feels kind of like a Warhammer plot, but it doesn't feel like a particularly strong one, and the characters themselves are not particularly compelling because they're kind of over the top and ridiculous. That said, when you actually get into the meat of the game, it really does make up for this shortcoming. And so, what you have here is a fairly traditional real-time strategy game in some respects. Obviously, you have base building aspects where you have to build various buildings that will allow you to construct new types of units, and as you go through, you'll get more and more advanced buildings to build more and more advanced units. The differences are really in the details here. You have a variety of units that can be upgraded in various manners. Now, you would expect this in most real-time strategy games to be something along the lines of going to a building and just clicking a button that says, give them more attack power. And that is certainly here, but also, when you actually get into the squads themselves, you can equip them with various other types of weapons. For example, Space Marine tactical squads start out with just bolters, which are certainly powerful weapons. But you can also equip them with plasma guns, for example, which gives them much more damage against heavily armored opponents. Or you can give them flamers, which makes them more effective against infantry and such like that. And so there's a variety of these upgrades that you can give to your various units, and then also replenish units as they lose guys in their squad. For example, if you have your tactical marines lose a couple of members, you can hit the reinforcements button and they will actually gain new units and basically heal the unit back up, which is kind of cool. You can also have commander units that can be added to these various squads, which will also give passive bonuses as well. So there's more customization with the units than you're used to in most RTSs. On top of that, they changed up the way that you get resources. Instead of basically having to go to a resource point and mine, for example, and then bring it back to your base, you now have resource trickle rates. And you get these by building power generators, as well as controlling various points in the map. Now, these points can take three different forms. You have your strategic points, which when you can reinforce them, they'll upgrade the amount of requisition points that you get. You have critical locations, which are basically how you win. The idea there being that if you control those points for a certain amount of time, then you basically win because you've reduced the enemy down to nothing. And then there's Relic, which allow you to construct your most powerful unit. And so if you control those, then you have access to your most powerful unit, and you can basically steamroll the enemy. Well, maybe anyway. There are certainly ways of defeating enemies who've managed to get their ultimate unit, but it makes it a lot harder on you. And so there's this sort of balancing act. You want to be somewhat aggressive in controlling the points and building up your army so you can go and crush the enemy before they really have a chance to actually be able to fight back against you. But at the same time, you don't want to neglect your own defenses. And so the gameplay in this ends up being quite a lot more dynamic than most other RTSs out there. And so what you end up having is this game that is actually more centered around the combat than anything else. And the combat itself is very, very interesting. You actually have cover in this game, and cover actually gives your units defensive bonuses. So you want to have your units in cover, and you don't want the enemies to find cover. How do you do this? You have various things that you can use to just hit them in cover, like grenades, for example. And it's really this tactical depth that makes the game shine. You end up having these situations where you're going to want to move your units around, because instead of just entrenching them in one particular spot and having them just mow down anything that comes in their way, you can find ways around that. And various units are going to be able to take care of that, so you need to be able to just adapt on the fly, which is something that you don't really see as much of in other RTSs. It's all fairly straightforward stuff. And so here, you have these various factions that often play wildly differently. For example, the orcs have an additional resource, and that is orcs. And it's stuff like that that makes the game just really interesting to play. There's a ton of variety here. And if you're wanting to customize things, they even have an army painter, which is something that's huge in the tabletop game. Having your own custom army is just an integral part, where you have your army painted the way you want it to, with your own custom color scheme, with your own custom emblems and all that sort of thing. And they have that here as well. Now, they do have a limit on the symbols that you can have. They didn't really fix that until you got to Dawn of War II Retribution, where they finally added in the ability to do custom shoulder images. But that's kind of beside the point. The ability to paint your own army the way you want it to be is just really cool, and it adds even more customization to a game that's already pretty varied in the amount of units that you get, as well as how you can use those units. And so what you end up having here is a real-time strategy game with plenty of variety that will keep you going for a long time, and a surprisingly strong sense of balance, where if you know what you're doing with your individual faction, you can get things done. Now granted, there's only 4 factions in the base game. You have the Space Marines, the Orcs, the Eldar, and Chaos. But each of those plays pretty wildly differently, so you have plenty of variety there. The only real downside, I guess, is that the campaign is not particularly interesting. Obviously, I've already talked about the plot, but the gameplay itself is pretty much what you would expect after having played real-time strategy game campaigns before. It's not the best campaign out there, it's not the worst campaign out there. It'll certainly get you through some gameplay, and you might be able to find some enjoyment out of it, but by and large, it's pretty standard fare. It's really in skirmish and multiplayer where this thing really shines. So ultimately, I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.